23. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to be here tonight. And I'd ask that any of us that wish to revise and extend our remarks be given 5 days to do so.
Without objection.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're going to talk tonight about this debt ceiling, this mysterious debt ceiling that we hear so much about. And I'm joined by two of my colleagues that have strong ideas about this as well. But I want to just relate something to America so you can hear this. We had a meeting several weeks back talking about the debt ceiling. And I don't think anybody had ever asked this question. And I started asking it at every meeting. I said, how much does the Biden administration want to raise the debt? We're set at $31.4 trillion now. We spend $4.9 trillion a year, $6.1 trillion a year, but we raise $4.9 trillion. Every month we fall short by about $100 billion. And so I said, how much do they want? Well, when I first started asking the question, I said, well, everybody said, no, I don't know. We don't know. But now it's $4 trillion. That's what I'm hearing. It's $4 trillion. Tonight we heard 3.5. But in any event, it's $3.5 to $4 trillion. So I asked the next question. I said, look, I really want to know what happens if we don't lift the debt ceiling. I don't know. These guys might have been there. The fellow was nonplussed. This former deputy at the OMB, Office of Management and Budget, economist. He stood there for probably 2 minutes. Nobody had ever asked him that question before. And he says, nothing will happen. And I said, how can that be? I'm hearing that it's collapse city. Tell me, how can that be? He said, all the bills go to OMB, and they get forwarded on to the Fed, and they all get paid as they come due, and they just keep paying them. I'm here to tell you that the debt ceiling is mysterious. It's a black box. It's the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. And it's time for us to face the facts that if they're going to try to leverage us, then we have got to do something to make this more responsible, the spending more responsible, and get our budget back together. With that, I'm going to yield such time as he may consume to the gentleman, my friend from Montana, Mr. Rosendale.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much, Representative Biggs, my good friend from Arizona. Mr. Speaker, President Joe Biden wants to raise the national debt by over $3 trillion over the next 2 years. Washington is bleeding American taxpayers dry with their addiction to spending with no end in sight on this endless financial disaster. The U.S. already has roughly $31.6 trillion in debt with no concrete plan to pay it back. Most folks cannot even fathom how much money that truly is. But Congress can avoid raising the debt ceiling almost indefinitely by returning spending to pre-COVID levels and practicing fiscal responsibility. On March the 28th, my colleagues and I proposed targeted cuts to non-defense discretionary spending that would reduce the deficit by $100 billion over the next year and reduce the total spending by more than $1 trillion over the next decade. I am proud to co-sponsor over 500 bills that were introduced by Representative Andy Biggs to achieve this. These are concrete, common-sense proposals to eliminate woke and wasteful spending from our federal government. We must rescind unspent COVID-19 money and stop funding the radical left's wish list like the IRS expansion, wasteful green energy projects, and student loan bailout. Congress can still pass a strong budget which protects Social Security and Medicare benefits without having to raise the debt ceiling at all. Yet, Democrat leaders have yet to respond to this proposal, and the President has made it clear that he is unwilling to work with any Republicans. Biden's proposed budget of $6.8 trillion represents a nearly 32% increase in spending since the COVID-19 pandemic began. Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, my fellow colleagues, the pandemic is over. The federal government was big enough in 2019. The American people were taxed enough already in 2019. When the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed, it lowered federal taxes for all Americans. That's right, for all Americans, and led to the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. And it's generated nearly $1 trillion a year more in federal revenue. It's inappropriate for the president to ask American people for even more of their hard-earned money when there is still over $100 billion in unspent COVID relief money lying on the table. There are too many wasteful organizations and woke government programs that do almost nothing for the American people, while costing them billions each year in increased spending and increased regulatory burdens. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office produces a long list of federal departments, programs, and agencies that are still no longer even authorized. But many of these programs still receive funding. This is just one example of the countless ways that Congress could address our spending addiction. Mr. Speaker, our deficit is getting worse every year. Congress has failed in its duty to provide sound stewardship of the American finances, and we are all facing the consequences of this failure. Worse yet, the consequences of our decisions will fall on the future generations of Americans. We all need to come together and find a solution to this problem and shrink Washington and grow America. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman from Montana. He mentioned unauthorized programs that we're continuing to fund. There are more than 1,200 federal programs that are unauthorized right now. $500 billion. That's what we spend every year for those 1,200 unauthorized programs. Congress hasn't authorized them. They've expired. We haven't reauthorized. But we're still spending $500 billion a year. And people wonder what's crazy about D.C. Let me give you one more data point. That same meeting that we were talking about, the gentleman was getting ready to leave, this economist, and then we had another former, we had a former head of OMB there with us. I asked them, can you tell me how many agencies there are in the federal government? The answer was no. I said, what? He said, nobody knows. That's hard to believe. I couldn't believe it. So I did some more digging. Nobody can tell me. Nobody can tell me how many federal agencies there are. But we can tell you how much we're spending. We're spending over $100 billion every month more than we bring in. With that, I'm pleased to yield such time as he may consume to my friend, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Bob Good.
Thank you, Chairman Biggs, my good friend from Arizona, for your leadership on this all-important issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank you also to my friend from Montana and his remarks just a moment ago. The founders gave in the Constitution the authority for spending to the House of Representatives. It's the House of Representatives that most directly reflects where the American people are, what the American people's wishes are on a federal level. It's not the White House, it's not the Senate, certainly not the Supreme Court. It is the people's house, the House of Representatives, which proportionally represents everyone across the country, equally with some 800,000 citizens per representative. It's the House of Representatives that has the responsibility. We have the responsibility to ensure our ability to pay our nation's debts and to protect the credit or the borrowing capacity for when it's necessary of the United States federal government. We talk often about what are the threats, the greatest threats to the country. There are numerous existential threats to our country right now, I would submit like never before in the history of the United States, brought on by the policies of this administration, Mr. Speaker, and those who had the majority of both houses for the previous 2 years. Whether it's the open border, where some 6 to 7 million illegals have swarmed into our country, facilitated and helped by this administration's policies, whether it's our broken education system, our indoctrination on our college campuses, our K-12, whether it's the weakening of our military, our failures on the national stage, whether it's the threat of China, or whether it's our national debt and our spending. And as we address tonight and discuss the national debt and the spending and the debt ceiling issue, the spending piece of this, the responsibility of the House, is not just addressing that issue, but how we manage the United States spending. The federal spending addresses all of the other issues. To utilize the power of the purse, to stop funding the harmful policies, not just the wasteful, reckless spending, but the literal harmful spending that's making our country less safe, less secure, less prosperous, and less free. And as we talk specifically about the national debt, it's been said already tonight, over $31 trillion. I happen to serve on the Budget Committee. A couple of weeks ago, we brought before our committee once again OMB Director Young, Shalonda Young, the Biden administration's budget director. Funny term to apply budget director to anybody in this administration, Mr. Speaker. But as we were having a chance to question the budget director for the Biden administration, I asked Ms. Young, what is the national debt? And she could not tell me. She said it was somewhere around maybe 24 trillion, and I corrected her that it was over 31 trillion. I asked her, how much does that equate to per American citizen? She did not know. I helped her with the fact that it's nearly 100,000 for 330 million American citizens. 100,000 per citizen. That means about 300,000 per taxpayer or per family. I then asked her, what is the percentage of GDP? Debt to GDP. She did not know, Mr. Speaker. She thought it might be 90-something%, and I helped her with the information that it is about 125% debt to GDP ratio. I asked her when it was the last time it was that high in the history of our country. She did not know, and I helped her to realize it was World War II. To follow up on what you were saying a moment ago, my friend from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, we also had before another committee that I serve on, our Federal Reserve Chairman Powell, another caucus I'm a part of, the Republican Study Committee. And he spoke to us about interest rates and about trying to bring down inflation, shared his remarks, and once again did not deal with the issue of the national debt. Didn't even bring it up. Didn't even bring up the federal spending. And I said to him, what is the number one cause of the inflation? And historically, when we raise interest rates, we're trying to what? Cool a hot economy to ward off a recession. Instead, we have caused the inflation with the spending, and now we're making it worse on the American people by raising the interest rates in a futile attempt to reduce inflation in a weak economy and making things worse for the American people. Mr. Biggs, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the remarks a few moments ago from my colleague from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, I led a letter to Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen asking her about what Mr. Biggs was speaking about a moment ago. What is her plan to ensure we do not have a default when we reach the debt ceiling limit? How will she prioritize spending to ensure we don't reach that, we don't result in a default when we reach that debt limit? We have not gotten satisfactory answers to that. And Mr. Biggs is exactly right, Mr. Speaker. When we exhaust these so-called extraordinary measures, which part of my letter also asked, when will we exhaust those? How is that determined? Have not gotten satisfactory answers to that either. But the fact is, when we reach the debt limit and we can no longer utilize gimmicks and clever tactics to try to extend that, we will simply have to prioritize our spending. We've got a record $5 trillion coming to the Treasury, never happened before in the history of the country. Frankly, because of the Trump Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which has done what always happens in history: when you cut taxes, you get more income, more revenue. Don't let the Democrats and the majority or the administration lie to us, Mr. Speaker, and tell us we have a deficit because of the tax cuts. That's simply not true, with $5 trillion in revenue coming into the Treasury the first time in history. However, because, as Mr. Biggs said, we're spending over $6 trillion, if we reach the debt limit and we can no longer delay through these extraordinary measures, we will simply have to prioritize spending. It will force, that's why they don't want to do it. That's why they don't want to reach it. That's why they want your $3 or $4 trillion, Mr. Rosendale, Mr. Biggs stated just a few moments ago, because they don't want to have to prioritize spending. There's more than enough revenue coming in to fund Social Security and Medicare. There's more than enough revenue to pay the debt, the interest on the debt. We would simply be forced to cut discretionary spending. But we have a plan that we in the House Freedom Caucus have put forward to cut somewhere in the range of $1.5 trillion immediately out of the gate. And then and Mr. Biggs led the way on this with 500 bills with 500 specific targeted cuts towards those 1,200 unauthorized but still appropriated in previous Congress programs that would save us another $500 billion, so that we would never have to raise the debt ceiling again if we have the immediate $1.5 trillion in cuts now, and we use the appropriations process this fall to cut even further. And again, I yield back to Mr. Biggs, and I thank him for his leadership on this issue.
I thank the gentleman, and I inquire the Speaker how much time we have left.
14 minutes, sir.
Oh, great. Thank you. Let's see how much I can consume with that, Mr. Speaker. And I would have to say I commend you on your endurance, because you've stood the whole time, and I've watched you going now for two plus hours now. Well done. I'd be sitting down right now. So the HFC proposal that we put in just recently, and I think this is really important. The idea is to shrink Washington and grow the country again. We proposed it in early March. The first thing is you cancel the student loan forgiveness plan, which totals $609 billion. You cut the wasteful, woke, weaponized spending programs to get the nation back on track. You eliminate Green New Deal tax credits and subsidies. I recently scored it at 350. I'm told now it's $400 billion. $400 billion. Between those two items alone, you're moving towards $1 trillion. You cut the IRS expansion. We already passed that out of the House. That's $80 billion. You take into account the 500 targeted reductions that we've made. Maybe you don't do all of them. Maybe you only do half of them. Maybe you do 50, 75, $80 billion worth. Then I'll tell you something else that you got to do. You take back the COVID money that we send out. There's about $80 billion of that hasn't been spent. Bring that back. All of that's in the first year. And I haven't even talked about reductions. That's the rescissions. Then you start reducing. And you can make them targeted. You can do the discretionary. And guess what? You start getting to a place where you are not blowing. You're not in the hole $100 billion a month. How about doing that for a year? How about doing that for a year? Well, I'm told that a lot of these folks don't really want to do that, and I find that hard to believe. So in fiscal year 2024 alone, if you add to what I just outlined, what we proposed, we co-sponsored, those 500 bills, we just want you to look at them for mercy's sakes. If you took all of them, you'd be a little bit over $100 billion in savings in fiscal year 2024 alone. Wow. There are ways out of this, aren't there? But it's going to take some courage, some discipline, and quite frankly, part of the reason that I wanted to do this tonight is I'm hearing all the time that we don't know where you guys are. And I'm like, how can you not know where I am? I've been so explicit, I'm transparent. Everybody knows where Biggs is because Biggs doesn't keep his mouth shut. This is where we need to be. We need to be telling the truth. And the American people need to understand clearly what's about to happen to them. What's about to happen to them is they're going to raise that debt ceiling. Somebody's going to raise the debt ceiling. The idea that they're talking about now, just so people know, is anywhere from $1.5 to $4 trillion. That's what they're talking about. And they're going to trade it for 10 years with maybe $3.5 to $4 trillion in reductions, in savings, net savings. Not even net savings, I'm sorry to say that, gross savings. That's just, so over here on that ledger, you're going to get $4 trillion over 10 years. But if you raise the debt ceiling by $1.5 to $4 trillion over those 18 to 24 months, now extend that out for the rest of that 10-year cycle. Yeah, you're not raising the national debt by 24 trillion, you're raising it by 19 trillion. So you're still hitting $50+ trillion because you didn't have the courage to make the reductions and the hard choices this year. My favorite thing to hear around here is we're going to have a 10-year plan to balance the budget. I can go back and show you people from 15 years ago. They still relive that first year over and over again because it is like deja vu. So this year they're telling everybody, oh, okay, we're going to do a 10-year plan. It's going to be great. We think we can get balanced in 10 years. Going to have to make some tough decisions. But next year they'll come back and say, we got a 10-year plan. We're going to have to make some tough decisions. And 2 years from now they'll come back and say, hey, we got a 10-year plan. Do it now. Do it now. And people tell me, well, you're conflating the budget with the debt ceiling. Well, you know why? Because I can tell you, if we don't do it now in the debt ceiling, when that budget comes around, you're going to have an omnibus bill. You're going to have an omnibus bill. That's what's going to happen. That may not work, so you get a CR. Well, part of the package HFC put out was that if you end up with a mandatory CR, you start reducing funding on that. And so you never have a government shutdown, which is in some ways too bad, quite frankly. Then we've also proposed adding the REINS Act. The REINS Act says before a bureaucratic agency can impose rules on anything that will impact more than it's $100 million, right? I think that's way too high. I think it should be like $10 million, but they're telling me it's $100 million. Then you have to bring it back to Congress. I think that's a great place to start. You know why? We have delegated our authority to the bureaucracy. So you get the bureaucracy out there, they're making rules. That's the same thing as legislating. They're enforcing the rules. That's the executive branch power. And they're adjudicating whether you've committed a violation of the rules and fining you. In some cases, most of the 40,000 crimes that are federal in nature were created under the rulemaking process. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm just telling you, our government is out of control, our spending is out of control. And guess what? If we went back to 2019 levels, which is what we've proposed, if you go back to 2019 levels, which nobody would say, we had too little government in 2019. If you go back to those levels, guess what? You can pay it because we were spending about $5 trillion, and now we are bringing in about $5 trillion. So let's go back to the 2019 levels, for Pete's sakes, and then let's do the rescissions to boot, and let's stop this endless cycle, or seemingly endless cycle, of national debt increase. And if we do that, then guess what we do? We stop the imminent bankruptcy of this country. We stop the devaluation of our currency around the world. We stop the inflationary pressures. And then once you do things like reduce some more taxes, reduce some more regulations, get some better energy production, well, then we go again to be the world's economic leader. Well, I'm just here to tell you, we've got a plan. We've presented our plan. I don't think anybody should ever say, Mr. Good, Mr. Rosendale, Mr. Biggs, and a half dozen others or so, that they don't know where we are. Tell you what, I've never voted to raise the debt ceiling. I don't think that's what I was sent here to do. And I'm finding it awfully hard to believe that there's any justification for raising it $2 to $4 trillion. I encourage everyone to understand that we can put an end to this cycle of self-immolation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Happy to move that the House do now adjourn.